Good morning. My name is Hugh Patterson, and this is a presentation at the ARSC conference in 2022. And I'm be talking about the Open Language Archives community known as OLAC and how it can be used for ethnolinguistic collections. And then I'll take a quick review of one record at one participating archive to kind of demonstrate how some audio has been archived, and I'll give two discussion points on that record. So just for a quick overview, ethnolinguistic versus ethnographic. Ethnolinguistic takes language as its central discussion point and its worldview into looking at a community or a collection, and it's the reason that the materials were assembled together, right? So language is central, whereas an ethnographic takes perhaps the people and says, okay, what languages or other cultural points belong to the people. So in my view, I think I side a little bit with the linguistic anthropologists, and I think it's all important. And if you're looking at language in its proper use, you need to know stuff about the culture of the people and what is the culture of a people without their language. I see great value for both kinds of collections participating in OLAC's aggregation of collections. Now, there's about 65 different data providers, and most data providers to OLAC are concerned with the minority languages of contexts. So for instance, I've worked in Mexico, and there are about 282 different languages in Mexico. And many of those are indigenous languages. Almost all of them are, I mean, except maybe Spanish. But there are other communities. I know of some Italian communities that speak a little bit of Italian in Mexico. So, but we're not really talking about that. We're talking about indigenous languages of the community, of the country. Mexico is not just Spanish. I've also worked in Nigeria, and there's over 500 different languages spoken in Nigeria. My work was in the Northwest, particular region there. So in Oregon, where I'm broadcasting from today, there's 9 federally recognized tribes, but the linguistic diversity is much greater. There's approximately 17 languages just in this map area here. So diversity and looking at languages is very important, and it's part of the great deal of research that goes on. OLAC's goal is to support that. So of the collections that I've had experience in and reviewing and looking through and helping to assemble it that are aggregated to OLAC, there's a lot of kinds of materials. Let me just kind of go over those a little bit so we kind of have like an understanding of what my background is. May not be completely the case for your collections, but in collections I've had experience with, there's often field notes that may be bound in a notebook of some kind, but they may be loose, unbound. There are often unpublished audio recordings of interviews or folk tales or music. And then there might be also video recordings. I've seen some moving image materials in the collections I've worked with. Published articles, grammar sketches. From a linguistics point of view, that's kind of normal. And photographs are certainly included in some collections, and dictionaries are a big component. So of these kinds of materials, they can have several different kinds of relationships between the artifacts, right? So we can have co-creation relationships where maybe a audio recording was done and then some field notes were done at the same time. We could also have derivative relationships where the audio recording was done on tape and then it was digitized to a WAV file, or that there was a transcription that was done from the tape several years after the initial recording. Many of these materials may live in aggregates. So you might have the bound field notebook have separate works inside of it. And so it's an aggregate by nature of its binding. Tapes may have be aggregates themselves, as in there might be several different field sessions and recordings and speakers and different types of interviews or stories on the same tape medium carrier. So aggregates can also, though, have things like in linguistics, we also might have transcriptions and their original source audio. So aggregates are important to put into the record, and how these relationships are created or maintained for discovery purposes and understanding the full scope of what was produced and what is preserved. So kind of talking about OLAC and its role, it's an aggregator. Archives share via OAI and Dublin Core, but the big problem has been for many years that these minority languages don't get the proper cataloging or the proper indexing for the language types that they are, and so they get glossed over as a Bantu language or a language of Mexico or something like this, and so the specificity of the linguistic diversity in these collections is not surfaced. So OLAC helps people find collections that are specific about and resources of different kinds, collections and resources about languages. And they do that through a website. They do that with keywords that are particular to those kinds that linguists are familiar with. You've probably seen this model before, and this is the basic model that OLAC works with. Archives provide indexes. It's not a union record. This is not a, institutions retain their complete sovereignty over their records, but this is simply an aggregator. So it uses, as you might be, we'll see some example projects that you might be familiar with if you haven't heard of OLAC before. So PubMed is one in the medical sciences, a US government sponsored 34 million objects, Digital Public Library of America, 45 million objects of all different mediums, and Europeana. Many GLAM institutions participate in this. I think almost 2,000 for 51 million objects and records aggregated specifically for linguistics and language resources. And the green box is Virtual Language Observatory, which has about 1 million objects, though maybe 600,000. MetaShare is got about 3,000 collections. I think they kind of specialize in corpora, so they're kind of like a collection. And then OLAC has about 300,000 records across 65 providing data institutions. Kind of like when we say language resources, so I've been saying language resources, it's a term that linguists kind of use to talk about resources that kind of exhibit language and kind of, it might be an audio recording, a video recording. There's a lot of different modalities. If you have a scholarly publication, corpora about a particular that compares two languages, or parallel corpora or something, specific software or services, like a grammar parser or something like that. Those can all be language resources. So OLAC looks at these, and the OLAC architecture is kind of like this. You have the Open Archives Initiative protocol, and then that uses Dublin Core, and then refining Dublin Core is a set of vocabularies that are custom to the OLAC communities that these archives have decided to use. So if you're not familiar with OAI, it's pretty simple standard footer. It's a short description of the record providing institution. And it uses OAI PMH, which is, OAI comes in two flavors, ORE, which is for resources, and metadata, or PMH, which is only for metadata. And so it's just sharing metadata, it's not sharing the resources. Dublin Core, if you're in the metadata business, you've probably heard of it. It's designed for these large sharing projects, and indexing is where it's really found its niche. and you may have a more specific usage of metadata. Maybe you use EAD or MARC records or something like this. But Dublin Core is more broad for, and it's designed for sharing contexts and indexing contexts. So some tools like DSpace use Dublin Core at their core, and that's what they use. But here we have the elements in blue, and we have the terms in black. And then there's a couple of different elements that have different syntaxes or particular vocabularies that you can use. Library of Congress subject headings, the DCMI type, or Dewey Decimal, not decimal, but the Dewey classification system. IMT is the for formats for the internet based, format specifications for digital files. This kind of gives you like a broad overview. You see there's different kinds of subjects, ways to express subjects. There's different kinds of ways that you can express relationships, the source of an item or the format of an item, different scopes of coverage that the item have, and different creation dates and things like that. So I'll just talk a little bit now about the particular vocabularies of OLAC. So this is probably for many the new information. So linguists and researchers who deal with language, not just linguists, but the broader research community, when we are recording or producing language resources, we're interested in defining contributor a little bit more clearly. These are largely borrowed from the MARC participant roles, but they have some of their own semantics here in the OLAC context. So we define some roles a little differently. And then we have the type. We have two different vocabularies for type. We have a discourse type, which would be dialogue discourse or oratory or narrative discourse or singing or unintelligible speech, those sorts of things. We have a linguistic data type. So is it a lexicon that we're sharing, like a dictionary kind of thing? Or is it like a primary text where somebody's telling a folk tale or a narrative of, or is it a language description, like a scholarly article? Then are we talking about, and subjects is another place that we specify. Now, some of these subjects are mapped directly to Library of Congress subject headings, but these are the terms that are more widely understood. So at least they're more accessible to linguists. So this would be a way to do that. Now, a very important component to this is the last one here, which is a defined subject and the Dublin Core language element, and that is ISO 639-3. Now, this is used in libraries and library standards and in computer science standards. So software communication protocols and web page declaring what language are used in those web pages contexts. So it's got broad usage, ISO 639-3, and this is kind of one of the things that kind of drives the ability to search in OLAC. So that's really important. And from talking to some of you in previous years, but talking to other archivists as well, I understand that many archives keep their collection metadata in one format and maybe item description in another format. So some use EAD for everything or just for collection description and don't have item description. Others might have specific MARC records. Some item description may already be done in Dublin Core. And so maybe there's only minimal work that would be done to think about aggregating that to OLAC. So when I talk about ethnolinguistic collections and the indexing, OLAC providers just kind of give you a rough kind of overview. Certainly every provider has their own unique situation, but some are, many are housed in institutional repositories that are driven by software like Fedora or DSpace. particularly common in this community is DSpace. But not all of them are DSpace, right? So, so DSpace at its core has Dublin Core, but then many have augmented with either institution-specific schema or with OLAC fields. So now to talk about an item record in audio. So this one comes from Kailo Pulahone, which is managed by the linguistic department in University of Hawaii, Manoa, but the institutional repository is managed by the library there. So and this particular artifact is in the collection for Marshallese and from the 1950s and B1018. And the artifact as presented includes 4 digital objects, 2 MP3s and a WAV file, right? So when we look at the metadata available, this is not looking at OLAC itself. This is looking at the actual archives website. We find this very interesting thing that the format is not WAV or not MP3, but is declared to be a cassette tape. So this brings us to a very interesting question of what is the metadata here? Is the metadata here related to the artifacts available through the institutional repository, or are they related to some other accessible entity, like a cassette tape? See, there's no cassette tape here in the record. And there are a couple other interesting things here about these records. So I'm critiquing the record a little bit. And some of the things are not true Dublin Core. And some of the things are just very interesting for other reasons. And one of the things that I've looked at the archive records of some institutions that are in OLAC, I've come to appreciate the Ferber model. Some of you may have heard of this, but it's kind of a way of organizing records and is used by RDA now, or is in the foundation part of some of the thinking behind RDA. Resource description and access, the framework that's kind of the uptake now in description. But it has really this four kind of levels, right? The work and the expression, the manifestation, the item. There's a couple of different ways to think about this audio artifact through this. And I wanted to demonstrate maybe 2 ways to think about it. And so if we say that there was a recording and it had a work and it was a single expression of that fieldwork experience, do we have then 2 manifestations once we digitize that? And if you've done some thinking in this area, I would really like to hear, maybe you have some experience doing some work like this in your institution. I would love to hear some feedback on this. But as far as I can tell, we would have 2 manifestations. Maybe one is the physical tape and one is the digital copy. And if we had 2 records instead of 1 record, then we would avoid some ambiguities like we saw in the Kailo Pulahone record. And we would then maybe have distinct provenance records or distinct rights records for the digital manifestation. But there's also probably a little bit of a problem even with doing this manifestation 1 and 2, simply as that. Let's think about it this way. So what is manifestation 1 if we, which is a cassette tape, if we have 2 or 3 different fieldwork recordings on there from different field elicitation sessions? It becomes an aggregate. And the proper way to do aggregates in Dublin Core is to not label them as audio, but to label them as a collection. So we would need to have the tape, the physical tape, instead of saying it's audio as a DCMI type, we would say it's a collection because there's multiple works inside of it. And so it may not be the case that it's appropriate to say these are manifestations of the same thing. But rather we should maybe think about it this way: as a collection, the tape is a collection, and then it has different recordings on the tape. Not all tapes are this way, right? Some tapes have a single session on them. So depending on the content, right? So this is all subject to content, but we would then have the 3 different works inside of the aggregate, and then part 1, 2, and 3. And then we would have the digital formats of those and have maybe a surrogate of the the archival quality digitization of the MP3 as the fourth, it has format, right? The 4th layer. So some takeaways here. First, your collection could get aggregated to OLAC. Let's talk about that. And maybe I can help you do that, help you understand some OLAC stuff, and we can have a collaboration and do some work together. Second is records in OLAC, records in Dublin Core and hence OLAC should indicate unique manifestations. That helps keep things clear when you're in a user interface that is derived from these records. It helps bring the proper relationships to people who are viewing those records and seeing them in the websites that are built from the data structures. And finally, manifestations should be linked to Dublin Core relationships. So if you have 2 records that are related, relate them richly. That might take time, but it's definitely worth it for people who are looking for these resources and for the audiences that the impact that we as institutions seek to provide. And provenance should indicate which audio captures are authoritative. So in the record that we looked at, there was no indication that there was which was an MP3 capture that was then later converted to WAV because that was, quote, best practice to hold a WAV file, or was it captured in WAV and then made a surrogate made so that you didn't have to download a 400 megabyte file. There's no statement to that effect or which one of those, and I've seen cases where it's done both ways, even though that is not ideal. So I just want to say thank you. And I wish you the best, but I would love to have a collaboration where we help you get your collections into OLAC. And if you have some things that you would like to share, I'm very open to hearing from you. And thank you very much.